Well, you can get off on the, if you take the highway. Traffic from the south is too.
I know. I put the tables out front thinking people would want them, but. All right, I think we're gonna get started here. So we might have some people trickling in, but that's fine. We're recording this, so in case you miss it, or if you want to revert back to it, you can go to our YouTube page. I'll send a link to everybody, including those who missed the training, so they can view it at their own convenience. So this is our poll worker training for the 22 and 23 election cycle. You're required to take a training every 2 years, so this is your lucky day. So bear with me. I'm going to take questions at the end, so that way people that are watching can just kind of sit through it. And then when we do go through the question and answer, I'll repeat the question so that it's in the record, so that people can know what the questions are and what the answers are. So restrooms, it's a huge place, so if you get lost, they're just right down the hall. And there is water too for anybody that's thirsty, so go ahead and go in the kitchen, they're in the fridge. So don't touch the pie that's on the top shelf, that's for Lori, so thanks. So just some statistics from the last few years, just so that we have an idea of what to expect for this year. Our 2018 spring election, which would be the one coming up, we had about a 40% turnout. That's probably the most comparable spring election that we're gonna see. And then you can see the 2018 fall, November statistics, relatively high, and typically the governor and presidential elections carry about the same percentage. So the big change we're seeing due to COVID is the absentee numbers. So you can see in 2020, the April election had 50% of the registered voters voted absentee. Now most of that is actually mail-in ballot, which is another change, because typically absentee ballots are higher in just in-person voting. For those 2 or 3 weeks before election, they can come in and vote. We've noticed a huge increase in mailing ballots, which has increased cost for postage and increased process time on election day. It's a little harder for you guys to go through those absentee ballots. Surprisingly, the presidential election, no, never mind. And then you'll see in spring that number dropped, but of course we didn't really have a whole lot going on in the 2021 spring election. It was just local elections. So you'll see a pretty big turnout, I'm guessing, for both the fall primary and the 2022 general election, just because of the contested offices, both in the Senate and the governor races. So the election cycle, these are the elections that are coming up. In 2022, we'll have 4 elections. We already had a fall election. You weren't aware because it was only for the Waukesha School District, so we had 2 voters, which was the best election I've ever been part of. It was amazing. And it was a 33% turnout for those 2 electors. So first one to the county, so that was great. And then we have 3 more this year. Obviously, the spring one coming up, we'll have a primary in August and then the general in November. 23 is going to be a slower year again. The odd years tend to be slower. We only have 2 elections during those years. And you can see when those elections take place, but your chiefs and I won't let you forget when those dates are. So for the poll workers, these are the positions listed: the greeter, you have voter registration, poll book people, people that issue the ballots, and then the chief inspector. Sometimes the chiefs will combine those positions to one, be it, a poll book person may also distribute ballots depending on how they want to set up their polling location. So the roles and responsibilities for poll workers: you must take an oath of office. I included the oath in your materials, so we'll go through that at the end of the training. You must have 1 training for each election cycle. This would count as your election training. You are compensated both for your time here and your time at the polling location. And some are also appointed by political parties. For those of you, you know who you are. And it's important that the chiefs know who you are too, because you have kind of separate, not roles, but you get to participate maybe a little bit more than a typical election worker. And that's just as checks and balances that the state has to make sure that that both parties are being represented and that we're all on the up and up. So I did the slide a little differently, just to kind of break it up. So if the material's dry, at least the slide's a little bit more, exciting. So the poll worker's job. So your main job is to facilitate the voting process, make sure that everyone gets through, the election lines, cast their ballot and leaves, and it's not a terrible time for them. Setting up the polling location, everyone's expected to get there a little early to help the chief inspectors to put up signage, open the doors, make sure the election machine is working, and that you guys are set for 7 o'clock. And then just be ready to process voters as they arrive, greet them, get them through the lines and out the door. So electioneering, I do this slide kind of early in the slide just because it's becoming more and more important. So for you guys as poll workers, no politically themed attire or materials such as t-shirts or buttons. That also goes for voters. If you see somebody that has a campaign sticker or something on their shirt that's promoting a certain candidate, must be removed before they enter the polling site. As far as you guys go, no conversations, political themed conversations about candidates, even hot topic issues that might be a part of a partisan nature. And no politically themed literature such as signs, flyers, or posters. That goes for anybody, whether you're poll workers or you're voting. Pretty self-explanatory, but the hardest part is trying to muster the courage to approach somebody, tell them that they need to remove something or they have to come back. But I think all of my chiefs have probably done that in the past, or if they haven't, lucky you. So, all right, assistance to voters. So all voters may use accessible voting equipment. We have an ADA machine. It gets used hardly ever, but we have it just in case. Poll workers should be familiar with how voting equipment operates. I'm not going to go through that today, but I will let your chief inspectors, they'll point out which poll workers are going to be using the equipment and train you guys appropriately. I like to have the chiefs kind of be responsible for the polling or the equipment, just because I don't want anything to break, and it's crucial that there's no errors and that we don't have any votes that aren't counted. All voters may receive assistance from poll workers or another assistant, and that's in regards to marking the ballot. If that does come up where somebody asks a poll worker for assistance, talk to your chief inspector before you help somebody mark their ballot or anything like that, and they'll walk you through the steps for that. All right. Different ways to help assist voters. So there's voter registration. Poll workers can help to explain the application, and they can fill out the voter registration for the applicant, but they can't sign the application for that. If a voter is unable to state their name or address, a poll worker can, on their behalf, So that's kind of interesting. And then signing the poll book. If a voter is physically unable, they can sign an X where their name is. Voting the ballot. A voter can be assisted in filling out the ballot or with using the ADA equipment. Assisters must fill out the section of the ballot appropriately. That means there's a section on the ballot that says assisted by, and then you mark your name. Again, I would push either your chief inspector or your chief inspector should push the ADA machine. It's a lot safer way, and then you don't have to put your initials on anything, which is how I prefer to do it. And then you can assist the voter in putting their ballot in the voting equipment. If you do have to help a voter do this, try to make sure that the voted side is facing down so that they don't feel uncomfortable with you looking at how they voted. And then curbside voting, and I think we have a separate slide on that. So pretty self-explanatory. Treat all voters with respect. Don't presume. Flexibility is key. Use people first language. Avoid commentary to voters or other officials, and treat all voters the same. Very self-explanatory. So these are the positions that you will be working. Who hasn't worked an election before? 2, 3, okay, cool. So the positions are greeter, registration, poll books, ballot table. The greeter is person responsible for meeting people at the front of the door as they come in. They help to assist in if you split up your lines and they have to get into a different line to figure out if somebody's registered to vote or not. If they're new to the town, they haven't registered. And just to find if they're in the right polling location too, which we often get people in the wrong polling locations, especially when it comes to day spring and town hall. That tends to happen quite a bit. Voter registration, this is a separate table where if somebody's not registered to vote, Wisconsin allows you to register the day of election day. So we'll do a separate training on voter registration at a later time. Typically, I think the chiefs kind of handle registration at your polling locations. But for November elections especially, you're probably going to need at least 2 or 3 registration people as it gets a little busier. So, and then poll books, voters present a photo ID at the poll book table. They state their name and address. The poll book person marks their name or gives them a number, a voter number in the poll book, and then either gives them a ballot which is initialed, or they send them to a ballot table where they get their ballot. And then ballot table, this is where you have 2 poll workers that initial the ballot and then distribute the ballot and give them direction as to where to go to fill it out and where to process it. So each polling location has voting booths that are set up. So if anyone's voted in the town, they know what those look like. Direct them to the voting booth, then direct them to the machine. All right, chief inspectors. Raise your hand if you're a chief inspector. All right, so we have 4 of them today. So these are your go-to people. Most of you know your chiefs already, but in case you don't, you just saw that all their hands. So that's what their hands look like. Chief inspectors are supervisors of the polling location. Chiefs will supervise poll workers for each election according to the list that I provide for them, or many of them are very good at keeping their own lists. Poll workers will be assigned roles based on their knowledge, previous experience, and where the need is for a given election. To be honest, I don't know which role is best for a new poll worker. I've worked them all, and I think they're all challenging and different in their own way. So you just might be surprised in where you're working. I would expect the poll book is probably one of the easier ones because it's pretty repetitive. But be ready for anything.
Well, sure, it's easy till you have to reconcile.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's when you give it to your chief inspector. So. Any issues that arise at a polling location should be addressed directly by the chief inspector, as I referred to marking the ballot, but there's so many different things that can come up. Media may show up, the provisional ballots will get to. Anything that's out of the ordinary from what you've pretty much been trained to do, you go to your chief inspector. If chiefs don't know, they'll call me. If I don't know, then I'll call the state or get an educated guess. So. And then the chief is responsible for making sure all paperwork is filled out correctly on election day and brought back to town hall at the end of the night. All right, voter qualifications. A voter must be a United States citizen, must be 18 years or older, must have resided in the town at least 28 days before an election, and must not be, sorry, it says must not be disqualified from voting under Wisconsin Statute 6.03. That means they must not be a convicted felon still serving a full-time sentence. They must not be adjudicated incompetent, and must not have placed a bet or wager on the election. I don't know why I keep that in the slide, I just think it's funny, but don't forget to ask every single voter how much money they've got on this one. So, I'll just do a brief voter registration introduction. We'll do a more formal training at a different date, but just so you can see what the form looks like. The biggest thing is the registration must be clear and legible. On this form, you can see the yellow highlighted areas are areas that must be filled out. The blue areas, depending on the situation, may or may not have to be filled out. I'll kind of skip to really the most important parts, and that is the address, the date of birth, and where is it? The driver's license number, which I can't see on this one, but those are the most important pieces of information, because if we don't have a driver's license number, if we don't have a date of birth, we can't find them in our system. The other important part when it comes to the clerk's office, maybe not to you guys, is who helped or processed the application. And that is just so that it gives us somebody to blame when they're not filled out correctly. So, so preferably print your name and don't sign, but that's up to you. And we'll go through that more in a registration training, and I will ask the chiefs to kind of give their list of people that they'd want to be on the registration table to us. So proof of residency, information showing that a resident resides where they do, must be shown to the person at the registration table, must be recorded on the bottom of the voter registration form, and we can go back to that slide. It's right in the bottom here. It asks for the proof, the type, and then the entity, and then the number associated with it. So that's what that's referring to. And then what constitutes proof of residency? You can see all that's listed there. Driver's license and utility bills tend to be the number 1 and 2, and then probably bank statement number 3. You can see all that's listed there, and there's even more than that, but again, that will be a separate training for registration. So, all right, voter ID. The difference between photo ID and proof of residence. This is a big one. I get a lot of questions on this. Photo ID does not need to be a current address. So if you've registered in the town of Delafield, but your address still shows West Dallas on your driver's license, as long as it's valid or at least had expired within the last general election, you can use that as photo ID. Proof of residency and photo ID address do not have to match. So if you have somebody that's registering to vote for the first time and they use their We Energy bill to prove where they live, their photo ID does not have to show that new address. So just make sure you make a distinction, because I've had plenty of people that say, well, your photo ID doesn't have your correct address, you can't vote. That's not true. What are you looking for in a photo ID? First, expiration date has to be either valid or had to not expired earlier than the last general election, which would have been the last November election. The photo reasonably resembles the person. I say that, but people change so much on their photos. So just reasonably resembles, and have a clear imagination when it comes to that. So, and then the name reasonably resembles either the poll book or the voter registration. And that's pretty self-explanatory. If a last name is changed, I would ask that you please have them re-register with their new name. So if they got married, 6 months ago, just have them re-register. It's a lot easier than trying to have us try and figure that out. And sometimes that causes issues with our reconciliation. All right, and then what type of photo IDs are acceptable? You can see the Wisconsin driver's license or Wisconsin ID is the main one. Military ID, passport, and there's a whole other list of acceptable IDs. And those are available at the polling location. We have them laminated for you guys so that you can see what IDs are acceptable. But most likely you're going to get a driver's license or a Wisconsin ID. Absentee ballots. Voters are unable to vote on election day or are indefinitely confined when cast an absentee ballot. They're processed at the polling location on election day, so you'll open all the envelopes and feed all the ballots into the machine. Voter names are announced before opening the certificate envelope that's holding their ballot. Ballots need to be fed through the machine by poll workers, and absentee ballots get assigned a voter number in the poll book just like any other ballot. If an absentee ballot has been damaged or is unable to be processed, the ballot needs to be remade by 2 poll workers, and this is where that political party affiliation comes in, by one of each of an affiliated party if the polling location has affiliated parties. Let your chiefs deal with that. You guys don't worry about it, but just something to keep in mind. And then certification envelopes are placed in a separate envelope. The remaking of ballots, from what I understand, is being questioned as to whether or not poll workers are able to do that. For now, it's still legal for us to do that, so we'll keep that in the training. If that changes by April, I'll let the chiefs know, and then we'll change that. Have you heard anything about that at all? Okay. Apparently they're challenging it, so we'll see. Yep.
Could you take one question?
Sure.
When we're at the poll, we made up some stories in my head about why the name is spoken when the absentee ballot is
Process?
processed. Can you give me the true reason?
Sure.
Real reason that that's done?
So the question was, why do we state the name of the person who's absentee voting if they're not there? And the answer is just for observers. You do the same thing that you would if they were in person. They would state their name. Since they're not there to state their name, you state their name. So it's just for observers, and that's it.
Just remember too, if someone has died, who has voted absentee, but has died before election day, their ballot cannot be counted. So that would be another reason to state someone's name, so that in that
Yep.
Event.
Yep. So I'm just repeating for the people watching, but if somebody has passed and you state their name and somebody happens to be there that knows that that person is dead, then they can, object to it. And usually there's enough time for us to pull either a death certificate or something of an obituary. And also for any reason to challenge the vote, that's another reason why you would state their name out loud if they happen to be a felon and somebody in the room knows that they're a felon or something like that as well. So good point. Thank you. All right, inspector statements. This is more for the chiefs, but the poll workers tend to have their hands on it in one way or the other. Inspector statements are logs of events that take place at the polling location. The first page has information on seal numbers for the voting equipment, results from the poll book, and the election machine. So it's a summary reconciliation sheet that goes to the county and it goes to the school districts along with the town. The second and third pages are notations for occurrences that happen. Anything that happens in a polling location that's out of the ordinary, including spoiled ballots, provisional ballots, challenged voters, curbside voters, remade ballots, ballot jams, anything that you can think of that's outside of the ordinary is marked on that inspector log. So it's very important that the times are noted, the codes are identified, and this also goes to the county. These are helpful in the case of a recount at the county. And for our purposes for reconciling the poll books with the electors and how we enter them into WisVote, which is our election system. Chief inspectors are masters of this sheet and should know everything that occurs during the day. So they're the holders of the inspector statement. All right, spoiled ballots. If a voter makes a mistake on his or her ballot, they may request a new ballot. You will need to spoil their first ballot by writing SB1, which stands for spoiled ballot number 1, on the ballot, tearing a 2-inch tear into the ballot and placing it in a spoiled ballot bag. Walk back to the poll book and mark the voter's name spoiled ballot 1. Reissue a ballot. Do not give them another voter number, as that will mess up your counts. And then voters are allowed a total of 3 ballots. So they get the first one, they mess up, they'll get a second one. If they mess up, they get one more, and then they're done. So I don't know if that's, yeah, Nancy?
Yeah. When you have the one who spoiled 2 of them already, I always put them on the other machine
Sure.
because they can't spoil one there.
Yep.
So you just say, I can give you another paper one, but when I guarantee you're gonna do it right, you'll use this other machine.
Yep. So Nancy's our chief inspector. She said if you have 2 strikes, use the ADA machine, the express vote, because you cannot screw up a ballot in the express vote machine. So that's a good point. Thank you. And if they spoil more than 1 ballot, follow the same steps above. Write SB2, and that just keeps track of how many spoiled ballots they have, so that you don't lose track of their 3rd one. So, all right. Provisional ballots. There are 2 cases given for someone to vote a provisional ballot. The first is a person has a driver's license but is unwilling to give their driver's license number. And this is only in the case of if they're registering to vote and they're using their driver's license as proof of residency. Let me double check that, sorry. Okay. Except it's if, sorry, a person has a driver's license but is unwilling to give it and they're not using their driver's license for proof of residency. Let me rephrase that. So basically the registration counts because they're not using their driver's license for their registration, but they won't give their driver's license number to you, and it's a requirement that they do if they have a driver's license number. The other is if a voter doesn't have the proper photo ID to vote, but they think that they can have a photo ID ready by the Friday following the election. So just to give a background of what a provisional ballot is, it's a ballot that a voter fills out just like any other ballot, but it doesn't get processed through the machine. It goes into a little blue envelope, and then it's held in an election bag until the Friday after the election. So from Tuesday to Friday, the voter has three days to bring in whatever information they're missing. So if they don't want to give you their driver's license number, they have to come into the clerk's office between that time frame and give us their driver's license number. If they don't have a photo ID, they have to come in and show us that they've had a photo ID, and then we can canvass their ballot before we submit our results to the county. If this comes up, tell your chief inspector. Make sure the voter understands their ballot will not go through the voting machine, which sometimes changes people's minds. We've had a voter that came in, they had a photo ID, but they didn't want to go all the way home, and they lived like a half a mile away. Didn't want to go home to get it, but once we kind of explain the hoops they have to jump through in order for their ballot to count, they'll say, okay, well then I'll come back later. So explain to them the hassle, and that tends to alleviate the situation. If a voter needs to vote provisionally, follow instructions Chief Inspector Binder has, so we have everything kind of shown as to what needs to happen. But like I said, get your chief inspectors, and then they can call me, and then I'll try and convince the voter to not do it. So, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I know you wanted to save the questions, but this keeps coming back
Sure.
to the driver's license.
Yep.
So my question is, if someone will present a photo ID that is expired, how is that considered a valid photo ID?
The state allows a photo ID to only be expired up until the last general election. So they can use it as as photo ID to vote, but for registration purposes, I believe it has to be a valid photo ID. I don't think it can be expired, and I'll have to double check that one. But yeah, but as far as photo ID goes, you're basically just proving that that person is who they say they are. So that's why they have that. It can be expired, but only up to a certain point. So. All right, sure. All right, curbside voting. So voters who are physically unable to enter polling locations can receive a curbside vote. In this case, 2 election officials, opposite political parties, if present, take an absentee ballot out to the polling location, to the resident, and they can fill out the absentee ballot in their car. The poll book should be marked curbside vote, and the voter needs to show photo ID still, so they're not exempt from that. They don't have to sign the poll book. You just write curbside vote where their signature would be. And then before the poll workers go out to do that curbside vote, they do have to announce in the polling location that a ballot is leaving the polling location for a curbside vote. This may increase depending on, you know, the COVID situation. We had quite a bit of those in the last few elections, so we'll see if things subside or if they still are, you know, if they're still popular to do the curbside vote. So did you guys have a lot of curbside votes in one? Okay, so maybe it's not that popular, never mind. All right, so challenged voters. Any qualified elector may challenge a voter who they believe does not meet the qualifications to vote. Those qualifications being they're a United States citizen, they're 18 years or older, they're not a felon, they're capable of voting, not deemed unqualified by a court, and they don't have money on the election. So it must be made for a reasonable cause, as what was discussed. Challenge recorded on the challenge documentation. There's an EL 104C form on the inspector statement, and then notations on the inspector statements in the poll list. There's challenge documentation worksheet that your chief inspectors will have, and they'll review that. Haven't had one of those since I've been here, unless I'm missing something, but I don't think the chiefs have had one of those in a long time. So if they approach, whoop, go ahead.
How do we know if they're a felon?
The question is, how do you know if voter is a felon? We have felon lists that are printed out, so those will be held at your voter registration table. The presumption is if they're already registered, they're not a felon because they should have been checked. Most people now register through the state's website, so they have a system of checking for felons. So then any new felon would have to be an election day registration, and that's where you have those lists of felons. And we provide felons for the whole Waukesha County, not just the town of Delafield, though if they are moving from outside of Waukesha County, then that may be an issue, but tends to be that the state flags those pretty quickly once they're entered into our system. So good question. So election day process at 7 a.m. The polls open for voting. Voters can enter the polling location. Make sure to use the same clock for opening the polls that you would when you close the polls. Meaning, if you use your Apple Watch to open them, use your Apple Watch to close them. Make sure there's no discrepancies or that one clock isn't 30 seconds off from another. Chief inspectors will instruct you to keep checking the voter number totals to make sure that your machine totals match what is in your poll book. So this is where numbers get thrown off, and that's why it's important every hour or so to check those totals to make sure that, you know, voter number 37, the poll machine says 37 votes, so you're on. If you're off, then that just makes a longer night for everyone. So just try and keep those numbers on. Busy times are usually in the morning during the lunchtime, and then typically after a work day, so usually around 5:30, 6 is when it starts really amping up, or maybe earlier, 5 to 6:30. The polls close at 8 p.m. An inspector, usually just a poll worker, gets in line right at 8 p.m. so that you're the trailer, so no one can get in line behind that person. An announcement is made by either the chief inspector or a poll worker just to state that the polls are now closed. Once the ballots have been put through the machine, the polls will need to be closed on the machine. Once the machine is closed, the result tapes print, and the totals get transmitted to the county wirelessly. So, okay. All required paperwork needs to be signed by 3 inspectors, and the chief is one that needs to sign, and that those are returned on election night. If there's a designated election official from a party, they need to sign all paperwork. So like I said, typically you have one from each party that would sign both, just for those checks and balances. 2 other poll workers will attend the chief to town hall, where they drop off all of the materials. That way I can review it, and if you guys are missing any signatures, I have 3 people there to sign it, and I don't have to call anybody in the next morning. And then a checklist will be provided to the chief inspectors indicating what needs to be signed. And I have a list of everything that needs to be signed here, which I won't go through. Your chiefs will go through that with you.
Keep saying, inspectors from different parties.
Yes. So the Democratic Party and the Republican Party send the town and in this case the town chairman, a list of political affiliated workers that they have to help us with election day. So those workers, those affiliates, try to be used in as much activity as possible that may become challengeable or questionable.
They're sent here already.
What's that?
They're sent here.
Yeah, so they may be here in this room. It's just poll workers that have a party affiliation. That's all it is. It's a way for the different parties, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, to show checks and balances by having 2 representatives to kind of be there. They're workers just like everyone, but they also are affiliated party just so that they can, observe, make sure everything's on the up and up. They're not technically observers, they're poll workers, but they're just affiliates. And
It doesn't matter what party I'm with, I'm not considered that.
right, like I said, you'll know if you are one. So I'm not saying if you're a Republican or you're Democrat that you're an affiliated party. You're specifically chosen by a Republican or Democratic affiliate. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, that means don't worry about it. So. All right. I don't like to bring those up in training just because it's a little, it's strange, but the chiefs will let everyone know who those people are, or let those people know that they have to sign or do certain things. All right. Election observer. So anyone other than a candidate up for the election has the right to be present at a polling location to observe the conduct of the election. So what you want to do is establish an observer area when setting up the polling location. Observers may examine or photograph the poll list so long as they do not interfere with the election inspector's responsibilities. Any other use of cameras or recording equipment by election observers at a polling location is prohibited. When I say set up an area, that means 3 to 8 feet is what the state calls for as far as how close election observers can be from the poll books or from election processes. So that 3 to 8 feet, I suggest going to 8 feet instead of 3 feet, just so that they don't interfere with lines and just the overall process. Cell phones, photos, and videos. Voters may silently use their cell phones, may take photos or videos of themselves if not disruptive, and may not take photos of other people or their ballots. Observers may use cell phones silently but cannot make or take phone calls, meaning they can text or do whatever. May not take photos of themselves or others. So observers have a little bit more stricter rules than typical voters. And then media is permitted to use photography, videography, if not used to record how an elector has voted, and is not disrupted. So they also cannot take videos or photos of people's ballots, only of the process itself. They can contact with voters should be limited, and then interviews should be held outside of the voting area. Typically not something we deal with too much here, but you never know. And then electioneering is any activity intended to influence voting at an election. We kind of touched on this already. But it is prohibited from public property within 100 feet of any entrance to a building containing a polling location. So electioneering could really be anything. It could be handing out flyers. It could be holding up a sign for a candidate, anything like that. Some considerations: bumper stickers, exit polls, bake sales, and other activities. So obviously you can't tell people to remove their bumper sticker. Exit polls are pretty typical, just make sure they're outside of the doors of the polling location. Bake sales, I still, preferably not is best, but if you're gonna do it, outside the polling location would be good. I know that the church was giving out cookies and coffee for a while, which is great because it's free. But even that is, it's a little questionable. I didn't argue it because I had a couple cookies that day, so it was fine. And then voting machines, we have two machines. The DS200 is the tabulating machine. That's the one that the physical ballot gets fed through. It tracks the voter totals, and it prints the tapes for us, which the poll workers sign. That also is the machine that has the most troubles, so it jams occasionally. If it is jammed, get your chief inspector and they'll work through what to do with those, and if the chief doesn't know, I'll come out and look at it. It will alert voters if they've cross-voted, over-voted, or if they voted a blank ballot. If that happens, just let the voters know, and if they want to vote the ballot the way it is, then you can bypass that error and let it feed through. Typically, if it's an overvote, then that's when the person's going to want to remake that ballot, because that means something wasn't counted that they wanted to have counted. Votes happen all the time, and I don't even think they warn you if there's an undervote. I think it's just a overvote or a cross vote or a blank ballot. Express vote, like I said, is used very infrequently. This is an ADA machine. It's a touch screen where voters can go through a process of just hitting the touch screen and voting that way. It's very simple to use, and it's almost impossible to make a mistake unless they just hit the wrong thing on the screen. But it takes a little bit of time to go through, and typically you need a poll worker there to assist that person in using it. It is good for, like Nancy said, if you have somebody that can't seem to mark the ballot correctly, maybe they have, maybe they shake when they write, or maybe they have a disability of some kind that prohibits them of being able to fill out a ballot. So, all right. So we have wards that are separated by school districts, senates, assembly, and congressional districts. I don't want to get too much into this, but especially for April, you need to know that there are 4 different school districts, and in April we vote for the school board. We have Kettle Moraine, Arrowhead, and there's 2 school districts within Arrowhead, Heartland Lakeside and Lake Country, and then we have a Waukesha school district. We have different state and assembly and congressional districts that are split by wards, which I won't get into, but just know that when you're going through, especially if you work at town hall, you're going to have different ballot styles. They're going to have different school districts. 3 and 4, if you work at the old schoolhouse, you will have just one ballot style, so good for you. It's just the Heartland, Lakeside, Arrowhead School District. And then if you work at the Day Spring Church, you're going to have mostly Kettle Moraine, with the exception of Waukesha School District. And I think there's 6 or 7 voters in the Waukesha School District. So, all right, and then this is the ward map. We did redistrict, and this is the result of that redistricting. The only major difference is Ward 3 and 4, the line right in here, or right up here, is changed. And I don't remember what it was before. I think it kind of went down. So we kind of messed around with that a little bit to even out the populations so that we were in compliance. And the only other change besides that is Ward 7. And I believe this used to be part of Ward 7, and now it's in Ward 8. Otherwise, not a whole lot changed, and it won't affect the election process as you've gone about doing it before. Most people don't know what ward they live in, so if they moved from Ward 7 to Ward 8, they probably never knew they were in Ward 8 to begin with. So, all right, and then new pending election laws. The 28-day change has been around for over a year, so but just keep in mind it's no longer 10 days but 28 days that you needed to reside in the town in order to vote. Absentee voting changes, municipalities can start in-person absentee voting only 2 weeks before the election. So it used to be right when we got the ballots, we could start in-person voting. That changed last year, so now we're limited to Tuesday, 2 weeks before the election, through Friday, the Friday before the election. And then email ballots are only now allowed for overseas, permanently overseas, and military voters. And then one other change that just came through a couple weeks ago is we are no longer allowed to use drop boxes for the collection of ballots. So if somebody has a ballot that they want to return, they no longer can use our drop box outside. They have to actually physically return them to us in person, or they have to mail them to us. And that's the only significant law changes, besides the questions of whether or not you can remake a ballot at the polling location or not, which is still up in the air, but I am very sure that we're still going to be able to remake at least for April. Okay. Questions? Yes.
When does an absentee ballot need to be received at polling location?
8 o'clock when the polls close?
Same day.
Yep, same day. Up until the time that people can vote, you can receive absentee ballots. And actually, 8 o'clock when we receive it, which means if you're working at the Little Red Schoolhouse, it might not be till 8:10 when I actually get there to give you the ballot. So, yeah, go ahead.
On page 6, having to do with the chief inspectors, they schedule poll workers, but priority is given to affiliated workers. What are affiliated workers?
That's what I was talking about, the political party affiliates. So the lists from the Republican and Democratic parties of poll workers that they've appointed, those people should get treatment first because, like I said, the checks and balances of the system, so that they can have party affiliates to help making sure that, let's say a curbside voter gets a ballot, you have both somebody from the Republican and Democratic side giving them the ballot, so that there's no funny business.
So
Not to say there would be.
As a poll worker, and I'm a member of a party, should I tell the chief inspector?
No, it would only be if somebody has to reach out to you directly. So somebody from the Republican or Democratic Party reaches out to you and asks you, do you want to be an affiliated party? Or if you want to be an affiliated party, you can reach out to the Republican or Democratic parties in order to do that. But like I said, it doesn't affect anybody that just wants to volunteer to be a poll worker. So like I said, it's more of an issue with the chiefs to make sure that the checks and balances of certain processes are done using those affiliated parties. But if you don't know anything about affiliated parties, then just don't worry about it. Yep.
So we still have unaffiliated poll workers.
Yeah, the majority of poll workers are unaffiliated. There's 7% of poll workers, or well, maybe a little more, maybe 15% are affiliated. So
So I can't put red stickers on the name tags for people in one party.
no. You can have your own little list and put little red stickers, but don't show it to anybody. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm still on page 6 here. For voter qualifications, you've already addressed the felony aspect and the betting on the election, the gambling. But what do you do for citizenship? I mean, how do we ascertain citizenship?
All right. I forgot to repeat the question. Sorry about that. So the question is, how can you determine whether somebody is a citizen or not? They sign their voter registration stating that they swear that they are a citizen and that they're 18 years or older. If they're not, then they're lying on what is considered an affidavit on the application, and the state will go after them when they find out, if they find out. So, and they usually do. I've been in cases where somebody has lied and the attorney general or somebody goes after them. I can't think of the name, but yeah, they have a district attorney. They go after those voters. So, yep.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments? Yep.
Would any pins or stickers that show a person is pro-Ukraine be considered political?
That's a good question.
I was thinking, 'cause
I'll get back to you. I don't want to give a yes or a no because it is definitely a statement, but I don't know if there's one party or another that would, disagree with standing with Ukraine. Oh yeah, so the question was whether if somebody shows support for Ukraine, whether it's a hat or a pin or anything that they're wearing, whether or not that is something that should be removed because of showing preference to a political party, I guess is the main purpose of it. So I'll get back to you guys on that, but my first answer would be no.
Well, if you look at this, it says electioneering is any activity intended to influence voting at an election. There's nothing on the ballot related to Ukraine.
There's not,
Yeah, this-
but there's always underlying issues that are always part of something. So that I might actually reach out to the election commission and see what their stance is on that. But very good question. I think Ukraine's the only one, but there might be another issue too. Drilling for oil, I don't know. Yeah, right, exactly. So, okay, any other questions? Yep.
So there's a sign on the drop box right outside the door saying, please put them inside, and you stated no drop boxes are
Yeah, so
used.
yep, so the Dropbox, it says, bring your ballots in here. That's the purpose for why we put that in there. So, they could still drop it in there, I guess, but we may actually have it removed the end of this week so that people. Yeah, we do have another small one that's not so easily removed, but I was debating whether we should just remove it completely, but we do like to have it for like building inspection plans and things like that. So we'll see. We'll probably have it removed on Friday. Any other questions? If not, everyone's free to go. Thanks for joining. Oh, yes, thank you. We'll do that now. So everyone can go ahead and raise their right hand. And I would say repeat after me, but I don't have it in front of me, so just go ahead and read. So I state your name. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, you just leave them on the tables and I'll go by and collect them.
You want us to fill in as much as we can, except for your signature?
Just fill in your name and your signature. We'll fill out the date.